So I'm Jerry Powers. I'm director of Catholic Peacebuilding Studies at the Prague Institute, and I am advisor to the Holy See's, the Vatican's mission to the UN on peace and environment issues. And I coordinate the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. It's a collection of a couple dozen Catholic institutions, university entities, development agencies like Catholic Relief Services, and independent Catholic organizations like Pax Christi International. And we have a secretariat here, and our job is to find ways these different Catholic institutions can work together on peace. And we have a project for the better part of the last decade on revitalizing Catholic engagement on nuclear disarmament. And this book is one product of that. So the world is schizophrenic about nuclear weapons right now. Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. NATO Secretary General is threatening to base nuclear weapons on Russia's border. Rather than commemorating the Cuban Missile Crisis, we seem to be reenacting it. And the nuclear arms control regime is in tatters, and the major nuclear powers are engaged in the largest nuclear modernization program since the early 1980s. At the same time, the past 2 decades has seen the most sustained, broad, and high-level support for nuclear disarmament. The world's nuclear arsenals have been cut by some 85% since the height of the Cold War in 2021. A landmark treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons entered into force with the Holy See, the first to ratify it, which means the Swiss Guards will have to continue to rely on their halberds, swords, and pikes to defend the Pope. No nukes allowed. In November 2017, as part of its longstanding effort to delegitimize nuclear weapons, and an effort to support the recently signed nuclear ban treaty, the Vatican convened a major conference on nuclear disarmament. Notre Dame's President's Office, the Kroc Institute, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, Georgetown University, and Catholic University of America joined in co-sponsoring or collaborating with the Vatican on that event. And the 3 of us on this panel were fortunate to participate, along with Professor Michael Desch and the dozen current or recent alums of Notre Dame. And to complement that Notre Dame delegation, the Vatican also invited 11 Nobel Peace Prize winners, just to complement the Notre Dame folks. The Vatican Conference was highlighted by a groundbreaking address by Pope Francis, in which he firmly condemned not only the use, but also the threat of use and even the possession of nuclear weapons. So that was seen as a very controversial move that Vatican law that against use. There's some question about, strictly conditioned moral acceptance of nuclear deterrence, but Pope said you can't even possess, it's immoral to even possess nuclear weapons. So several of us who've been working on this, in my case, since 1980, in your cases, also similar to this time, we asked, well, what does that mean in terms of policy and practice if the mere possession of nuclear weapons is immoral? What does it mean for the defense budget and all those good Catholics who vote for it every year, which includes nukes? And the Holy See's answer, well, that's why we have social ethicists and other scholars. You can figure out what we mean by the pastoral and the policy implications of the Pope's statement that nuclear weapons, even the possession, is immoral. So the late Father Drew Christensen, a Jesuit who one of the first faculty fellows here at the Prague Institute, and Carol Sargent of the Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion and Global Affairs, who's one of our key partners in the Catholic Peacebuilding Network's revitalizing Catholic engagement on nukes. They took the lead on 2 books. The first is called The World Free from Nuclear Weapons, 2020, Georgetown Press, which published the proceedings of that 2017 Vatican Conference. And then this year, Georgetown Press published the 2nd volume, which is called Forbidden. Now, the title notwithstanding, this is not a sleazy paperback novel. Rather, it is probably the most comprehensive book in English on the ethics of nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War. It features essays from moral theologians, defense experts, peace studies scholars, diplomats, and specialists in nuclear weapons policies. And its 32 chapters cover a wide range of topics, from the ethical and policy challenges of deterrence and disarmament, to the moral responsibilities of politicians, military personnel, scientists, defense workers, investors, educators, and others in dealing with the current nuclear situation. And it's fitting that this book comes out as we are commemorating the 60th anniversary of Pacem in Terris, which was Pope John XXIII's encyclical written right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the seminal document of the U.S. Catholic bishops in 1983 called the Peace Pastoral, or the Challenge of Peace, which is one of the best public documents on the ethics of nuclear weapons ever published. So the three of us on this panel contributed chapters to the book. Unfortunately, fourth panelist, Professor Hiro Miyazaki from Northwestern, was unable to join us at the last minute. So it would just be the three of us. Many of you know them, but I'll briefly introduce them. Margie File is a teaching professor in the Department of Theology of the Center for Social Concerns and is a faculty fellow at the Kroc Institute. She's the founder and resident of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community here in South Bend. And among her many publications, she is co-editor of Act Justly, Love Mercy, and Walk Humbly with Your God. David Courtwright is professor emeritus of the practice at the Kroc Institute. He is the author or co-editor of more than 20 books on nonviolent social change, nuclear disarmament, sanctions, and related topics. He has a long history of public advocacy for disarmament. In the late 1970s and 80s, he was executive director of SANE, which later became SANE Freeze, and the largest disarmament organization in the United States at that time. So let me turn it over to you, Margie.
Yes.
Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you, Jerry. And it's a great honor to be here with all of you. And I just I would like to remember, thankfully, Drew Christensen and also Carol Sargent, the co-editors. I think all of us greatly miss Drew, especially in these times. Just before we started, I said to David, what about Korea? And it just, since this conference, it seems that we're going in the opposite direction from what Pope Francis was inviting. As Jerry mentioned, I was part of that 2017 delegation at Jerry's invitation. And I remember sitting in I think it was the Clementine Hall with Tobias Wainwright, my friend and a colleague in moral theology who has for many years been at St. Louis University. And when Pope Francis condemned not only the use of nuclear weapons, but the possession of nuclear weapons, Tobias and I looked at each other and we thought, what will happen to everybody in the US? Just thinking about Catholics in the US who are working in the military, in the scientific community, in policy, not to mention all of the Catholic taxpayers, as Jerry alluded to. There's very little to no discussion or awareness in daily life about the US nuclear arsenal. And we talked with then Bishop McElroy immediately after that session and raised this issue with him. And he said, yes, it's an enormous pastoral challenge. And the issue of formation of conscience was first and foremost for us. And I left that gathering thinking long and hard about what it would look like to try to develop resources in formation of conscience around nuclear weapons for people in these various capacities, and in general for U.S. citizens. So Drew followed up on that conference by inviting people into dialogue around the pastoral implications of what the Pope had said, and we began meeting informally, and then he organized a conference with you, Jerry, at Georgetown in 2020. It was January of 2020. That was my last trip for a long time, I think, for many of us. And yeah, we had no idea, of course, that we were on the cusp of the pandemic, and nor did we know at that point that Drew wasn't going to be with us much longer. So I prepared a paper for that conference that is the contribution in the book around formation of conscience regarding nuclear weapons. And as Drew notes in the preface, and Jerry has mentioned, that the volume is intentionally wide-ranging and seeks to serve as a sort of handbook for moral discernment, both personal and social, around the elimination of nuclear weapons. And what's at stake from a variety of vantage points: military, political, scientific, ecclesial, familial, ecumenical, interreligious, ecological, as well as across disciplines. So I was interested in exploring in particular the dynamics of personal participation in larger systems, using Laszlo's systems theory and some of Joanna Macy's work. It's also an interest, a longer term interest of mine, to connect personal and social forms of sin and to notice the ways in which, as John Paul II said in Solicitudo Res Socialis, systems and structures can take on, can manifest moral disorder for which it's very difficult to assign personal responsibility. So we are all participating in larger systems that are manifesting objective moral disorder. And how do we name that? John Paul II said in Solicitudo, we have to name the moral disorders at stake in order to know how to address them. And I think that the larger systems devoted to the production and maintenance of nuclear weapons invites our attention, our moral attention, and I think it's helpful to think of them systemically. I think about the Manhattan Project and the particular dynamics that made it difficult to object in conscience in that case. So someone like Joseph Rotblat, I wrote about him in this chapter, who began to realize as a scientist, having come from Poland to the US and then being invited to work on the Manhattan Project, he began to realize the implications, the moral implications of what they were working on. And then when he learned almost by accident over casual dinner conversation that in fact the purpose of the project was no longer to outgun Germany, to beat them to the bomb, but rather to gain an edge over the Soviet Union, he became very uncomfortable morally with his own activity and tried to extract himself from the project, but that proved, of course, very difficult for national security reasons. So there was a kind of moral silence and silencing that he endured. And I think that kind of silence, systemic silence, is still with us with regard to nuclear energy. Stephanie Cook's book, In Mortal Hands, has been, for me, an important resource. I would recommend it. And she develops a very compelling case about the same stream of scientific research that around nuclear energy that was channeled toward development of weapons, but also what Eisenhower called the peaceful nukes program. So civilian peaceful nuclear energy. But when you start to dig, you realize that we have these larger systemic moral concerns. There's moral disorder at the heart of it, manifested not least, I think, in the intentional allocation of nuclear weapons development across every congressional district in the US, so that if one were to try to dismantle this system, if we followed what Pope Francis is saying, it would mean that we would be working night and day for nuclear disarmament. And in order to do that, we would have to work to conscientize people in every part of this country, not just Catholics. It's extremely difficult when you're talking about people's jobs, though. If by intention, nuclear materials are made across the country and tied to people's jobs, it becomes a very entrenched political issue. So again, the systemic dimensions of this are something to be aware of as we form our consciences. personally and socially. So what is required theologically and pastorally to support individuals and groups who discern in conscience that they want to follow Pope Francis's teaching, condemning nuclear weapons and deterrence? I think generating opportunities for education in parishes, schools, and scientific and policy contexts is a key step in that process of formation of conscience. I also want to lift up the lens of Laudato Si and its emphasis on the interconnection of all of creation as an important hermeneutic to cultivate. Jonathan Schell wrote, "The peril of human extinction in a nuclear holocaust is the middle term that links genocide and ecocide." He said, we've already developed the capacity to wipe out large swaths of human beings through genocide, thinking about the Holocaust and other forms of genocide. And with the climate crisis, we are in the process of ecocide. It's through that hardening of conscience that is required to commit genocide that we are more susceptible as human beings to lose our ethical compass around the threats posed by nuclear weapons. And that puts us in a very dangerous position to be able to be willing and able to sacrifice all of creation. And nuclear weaponry represents that. It's the annihilation of all life forms permanently. So at stake are not only the lives of individual members of a wide variety of systems, familial, social, political, economic, cultural, ecological, but also the very relational structures among these life forms that bind us together and provide a context for our existence. I think if we human beings truly allowed ourselves to understand the fact of our interconnection, we would be doing everything possible to eliminate nuclear weapons and also to avert all wars, because we would understand that such destruction is ultimately a form of planetary annihilation, including ourselves. I think the last thing I'll say in terms of formation of conscience, at the end of my chapter, I included questions for discernment. And those of you familiar with Catholic social teaching would recognize that method that has been used, for instance, by Paul VI and Pope Laureano Progressio, or the US bishops in their economic justice pastoral in 1986. Questions for discernment personally and communally. I think we need public contexts and safe spaces within which people can come together and engage in that kind of dialogical formation of conscience and discernment. Am I willing to continue paying taxes toward the maintenance, the creation and maintenance of nuclear weapons? Those would be the sorts of questions that I think we need to be asking personally and communally and ecclesially, if we're going to take seriously what Pope Francis was inviting, condemning not only the use of nuclear weapons, but their possession and the threat of use. I haven't said much about deterrence, but I think others, David and Jerry, might do that. But the threat of use, I mean, just yesterday, our president was threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the Korean context. How do we form our consciences to acknowledge that this is our reality and to be moral agents in participating in shaping a different reality? Where are the public spaces for that? Can the parishes be a space for that kind of communal discernment and conscience? I think they can be and really have to be if we're serious about this challenge that Pope Francis has given us. we're a long way from that, though. I think I've been in South Bend longer than anywhere, and I don't think that I've ever heard anyone in the parish context speak about nuclear weapons. So I don't think I've ever heard a homily on nuclear weapons or nuclear disarmament. So the gap between what Pope Francis was saying at the Vatican in 2017 and where we find ourselves even now in 2023 is vast. There's a lot of work to do, and I don't mean to sound pessimistic. I'm ready to get rolling with others to do the work, but I want to emphasize that we lack the space for these kinds of conversations. I'm grateful for this gathering today, but it's one of few that take place, and we need much more conversation and contemplative action. So that's there.
Thank you, Margie. David, you wrote about realism and nuclear disarmament.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marta. That's great. And I think it's a good intro segue to my remarks, because I think exactly the reality of the threat that we face and its moral and political implications is what has driven so much of the drive of the movement for disarmament, motivated Pope Francis, and certainly is the core message of these volumes. So fits well. And so what I want to do is just repeat a few of the things that I've written about in terms of the realist argument for nuclear arms reduction and elimination. And then also talk about the challenges of today and how and if we can try to take action, contemplative action, but concerted social action to try to deal with the problem of war in Ukraine primarily, but more broadly. And Ukraine war illustrating in many respects the dangers and the horrors of these weapons. So it's been the assumption in conventional thinking that those of us who are advocates for nuclear disarmament are utopians and are completely unrealistic and not to be serious, not to be taken seriously. But I've argued always that, au contraire, the utopians are those who think we can continue to rely on nuclear weapons forever and that disaster will not strike. So when Drew asked me to contribute to this volume along the lines of this argument, I was happy to kind of dig into some of the statements and reflect on the commitments of some of the most establishment figures in the national security state who've been at the heart of US military strategic policy and nuclear weapons, who have also argued against continuing to possess nuclear weapons and have outlined very concrete steps for eliminating these weapons. And there's a long history of this, but I think we can look at it in the context of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and especially toward the end of his term, and the possibilities for nuclear reduction that opened up in the Reagan-Gorbachev summits that led to the huge reduction in strategic weapons that we've seen over the last 30 years or more. And a key figure in the middle of that whole effort was George Shultz, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury, a conservative Republican, someone who's been an advocate of national security policy for many years, but who was there in the Reykjavik summit, in the room when Gorbachev and Reagan in 1986 were talking without their advisors, with just Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and Shultz, Secretary of State for the US. And the four of them talked about how to eliminate nuclear weapons. And the transcript of this meeting is in Jonathan Schell's book, The Abolition. And it's drawn from the transcript that was provided by the Soviet officials a few weeks after the Reykjavik summit. And they literally went back and forth arguing about and trading ideas for how to eliminate nuclear weapons, and came breathlessly close to actually signing a pledge to negotiate for the elimination of all nuclear weapons. And Shultz was in the room. It obviously didn't happen. It failed for a number of reasons. But 20 years later, when the anniversary of the Reykjavik summit was being commemorated at the Hoover Institution, Shultz gathered a number of key advisors, including Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, Sam Nunn, former Senator and Chair of the Armed Services Committee, and Henry Kissinger, the High Priest of nuclear deterrence theory, to support him in a pledge to work toward a world without nuclear weapons, and to commit themselves to work toward this goal. They issued a famous statement that was in the Wall Street Journal. They published several statements after that. And for the last 15 years of his life, George Shultz dedicated his time and energy to this enterprise, along with Bill Perry. Perry is still at it. I think he's about 100 years old now, or 99. And these guys could be out in the golf course or on a boat somewhere. Maybe they do that occasionally, but they're putting a lot of their time and energy into this cause, because they realize the threat and the very things we were talking about. And so many statements by these leaders help us understand the danger that we're dealing with. Robert McNamara was one of those who was an advocate for disarmament before the Shultz initiative. And he famously wrote that the combination of human fallibility and the presence of nuclear arms will lead inevitably to nuclear disaster and nuclear destruction. And many others have argued the same. And during this time, then there were a whole series of statements from McNamara. General Lee Butler, who was the head of Strategic Command, he called himself the most powerful person in the world. He was the guy who pushed the button to launch U.S. nuclear weapons. Dedicated himself as well to a project to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. The Canberra Commission was created, chaired by Foreign Minister Gareth Evans of Australia. Dozens of senior military commanders from the US and a dozen or other countries endorsed statements for the elimination of nuclear weapons. There really was an emerging consensus among some of the most hardcore military realists in favor of a program to reduce nuclear weapons because of the danger they pose, the risk that they could fall into the hands of terrorists, the risk that nuclear proliferation poses. And we have seen a slow but still steady spread of these weapons. And the reality that nuclear weapons themselves are a risk. It's the weapons themselves that are the problem, not only the deterrence theory and all the rest that goes with it. But by their very presence, they generate insecurities. We've seen that many of the crises that exist internationally today are in relation to nuclear weapons, whether North Korea, certainly, Iran, and even very much the crisis today in Ukraine. I'll come to that in a moment. So one thing we can say is that the realists agree with those of us who are idealists in wanting to get rid of these weapons, and that there's a strong case that they have made, and that gives credibility and legitimacy to what many of us have been saying for decades. And it's important also to realize that the idea of eliminating nuclear weapons is not something that happens all at once. It's a process. It would take many years. And one of the things that these military experts have done is to outline very concrete scenarios for how to steadily reduce weapons down to lower and lower levels, get to a point where there's only a minimal deterrence, as it's called, and then keep on building down to the point where you can be at a place where there are no nuclear weapons actively deployed. Even though we know that the capacity to build nuclear weapons will always exist, and that the capacity to rebuild will exist. And But even that idea has been developed by Jonathan Schell, by a number of Schultz's colleagues, to help us understand that in a way that's a kind of an existential deterrence, that this capacity will always exist. But we can, as a matter of safety and international security, build down towards zero and be in a state where we could verify and be assured that no state would have developed nuclear weapons. It would take a lot. Many institutions would have to be developed over time. And maybe that part is utopian given today's political environment. But it's not impossible. This is something that can be done. So the realist position is to advocate and move towards nuclear reduction. But today, of course, we're moving in the opposite direction, as Margie said, and the war in Ukraine especially has illustrated and brought to consciousness again the nuclear danger. The nuclear saber rattling from the Russian side is known and has been frequently commented on. I've kind of lost track of specific nuclear threats, but probably close to a dozen by now, by Putin, by Foreign Minister Lavrov, by the former Russian President Medvedev. On many different occasions, they've warned about, as Putin said, that there'll be consequences you have never seen in your entire history, and all this strange and threatening language that we've heard from that side. And we know what this is about. This is the use of nuclear weapons as a shield for conventional military aggression. And has been very consciously directed at the US and other powers to not become involved and let Russia do its dirty work against Ukraine. It's a sinister use of nuclear weapons. And it puts the lie to the notion that nuclear weapons help to prevent war. They're actually, as I say, a shield, a mechanism by which states can feel more empowered to use military force, brandishing this deterrent shield while they're waging conventional war. And the US has also used this concept. It's part of our military doctrine. Admiral Charles Richard wrote a couple years ago in the Proceedings of the US Naval Institute that we must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear weapons as they create the, quote, maneuver space, unquote, for us to project conventional military power. So nuclear weapons are used. They do not prevent war. And obviously there have been many wars since the advent of the atomic age. Yes, they do make it less likely that the US and Russia will use nuclear weapons against each other. But they also, as I mentioned, provide a tool that they can use to try to advance their military aggression and to subdue other states. So there are many sinister aspects to this war, and I think really we need to be doing more to try to figure out how to end this war. I just wrote a piece, I think it's coming out of Peace Policy, on where is the peace movement on Ukraine? What can the peace movement say about Ukraine? Yes, many of us sympathize with Ukraine and support their right of self-defense, but we ought to be doing what we can to end the war. When Cardinal McElroy was here a few weeks ago, he spoke very eloquently about this issue and the fact that we don't really have a strategy or an set of ethical principles in Catholic teaching around the termination of a war that otherwise might be considered just because of the cause of self-defense that one of the states is exercising. But nonetheless, I think we can do things. We need to advocate for a negotiated end to this conflict. Neither side wants to negotiate now, but I think negotiations are necessary. Most conflicts do end in negotiations of some sort, and a comprehensive negotiated peace agreement is the best guarantee. There's no absolute guarantees, but the best and most likely way of assuring that this war could come to an end and that there would be less likelihood of repetition, of recurrence. And a lot of the findings that we have in the Peace Accords matrix are relevant to how a negotiation might unfold. I'm working on a paper on that as well. As Josefina knows, I've been working on it for quite a while. It's taking a while, but I do think there's a lot there, and it's very complicated, but it's viable. And I think our role of what we can do is also to take action for peace action, and to advocate for disarmament. I think should be a priority, and partly for us as an academic and scholarly community, it's to address these very complicated dimensions of what a negotiated solution will look like, and help the parties try to come to an agreement to end this war. And with that, I think then there has to be a reckoning with the way in which nuclear weapons have been utilized in this conflict, and the way that they pose this continuing threat to international security. And last thing I'll say is, when the parties were in negotiations prior to Russia's invasion, there were a whole series of negotiations underway. And one set of those negotiations was between the US and Russia around strategic issues and arms control issues and East-West strategic architecture. And on the table were issues around resuming arms control and reestablishing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and developing some relationship between NATO and Russia into the future, in which Russia is feeling less threatened and can hopefully somehow be made into a security partner. All of these are tough issues, and they're much less likely now given the crimes of Putin and the Russian military in Ukraine. But they have to be on the table and have to be seen as goals in order to end the war, therefore end the heightened nuclear threat that the war poses, and try to establish some basis for more peaceful relations going forward.
Thank you. So my chapter was on ethical challenges that arise at or near zero. The Bishop's Peace Council in 1983 really was a seminal document on the ethics of use and the ethics of deterrence. I think those kinds of issues are important again now because of the situation in Ukraine, especially. So that document, I think, remains relevant. But the main focus of Catholic Church documents on nukes since the Cold War has moved from the ethics of use and deterrence to the ethics of disarmament. And the vision's been clear even before the end of the Cold War, really since the advent of atomic weapons. Every pope has said we eventually have to find a mutual verifiable agreement to ban nuclear weapons. So that's old teaching. But so the vision is clear, at least in Catholic teaching. The vision is clear in terms of these realists that David talked about, Schultz and Perry and others, of where we're going, which is really important. You need that vision. But you can't, but that vision is going to remain utopian, even when it's talked about by hawks and former nuclear hawks like Kissinger and Nunn and Perry, if you don't address how you're going to get there. So one gap that this book attempts to address is that ethics gap. How do you get, what does an ethics of disarmament look like? And so I try to address just a few questions that come up in two sets. The first set is, what's the relationship between deterrence and disarmament? Some of the church statements have talked about moving beyond deterrence. Like if you look at some of the U.S. bishop statements in recent years, they talk about moving beyond deterrence. I take that to mean you have to move beyond the existing system of deterrence. But you're never going to move beyond deterrence. As David mentioned, you're always going to have to deter, the use of, if you get down to minimal levels, the use of those minimal numbers, or if you get to zero, you have to deter folks from breakout or trying to rebuild their capacity. So deterrence is always going to be there. The question is, well, what kind of deterrence? When you're at the minimal level of weapons, say 50, 100 on each side, which would be a huge progress from where we are one problem that might arise is the concern about, are you allowed to threaten that which you're not allowed to do? So in Catholic moral theology, you're not allowed to threaten that which would be immoral to do. But if you only have a few weapons on each side, you're going to be tempted to threaten to destroy cities, as opposed to targeting military, like nuclear weapons. You're going to, the one theory of deterrence that you're likely to pursue is targeting of cities or city busting threats. And that would be considered immoral, at least in Catholic teaching. So one alternative to that is to say, when we get down to very low levels or zero, that you pursue missile defense. Now, in 1988, when the Reagan administration was pushing the Strategic Defense Initiative, the bishops did a very long document evaluating the morality of SDI or missile defense. Because the Reagan administration was saying this would be a morally superior alternative to threatening the use of nuclear weapons as a way to deter. And the bishops acknowledged that it could be, theoretically, but they were concerned about whether it would be feasible technologically. And they were concerned about its negative impact on the stability of deterrence and arms control. Because if the risk of missile defense is you create a defensive offensive arms race. One way to counter missile defense is you just build more nukes, and you build nukes that can overcome the missile defense. So you could create a less stable deterrent than you have now. And also the excessive cost. So the bishops basically opposed the deployment of missile defenses back in 1988. But what if you're down to a few weapons or no weapons? Would missile defense then be more morally acceptable and technically feasible? Perhaps, and also less destabilizing. But missile defenses can't stop all the nuclear threats. You could have nuclear torpedoes. You could have a nuclear bomb in a truck. There are lots of ways you can deliver nuclear weapons that missile defenses will have no capacity to address. So at best, at or near zero missile defense can supplant some, but not all forms of deterrence. You're still going to have some form of nuclear deterrence. So then you get to the question, well, what about this existential or virtual deterrence that David just mentioned? Father Brian Hare, who was a principal draftsman of the 1983 Bishop's Peace Pastoral, said toward the end of the Cold War that existential deterrence was the theory of deterrence behind the Bishop's Peace Pastoral. And McGeorge Bundy originally coined the term existential deterrence. So folks like Sidney Drell and James Goodby, among others, have suggested that a form of existential deterrence could work when a global ban is in place, since the capacity to reconstitute your nuclear arsenal would deter others from doing so. Now, on its face, a theory of existential deterrence would seem to be impermissible, because the Pope says that possession of nuclear weapons or recreating your nuclear weapons capacity is immoral. But I would argue that if a proper reading of the Pope's position would suggest an existential deterrent could be morally permissible, because the Pope's judgment about possession of nuclear weapons is immoral is based on his assessment that the current deterrent systems of the nuclear powers are not in fact being used as a step toward nuclear disarmament. They're an end in themselves. But if you have a very different scenario where you're at or you're near or at zero, then Pope Francis's prudential moral judgment wouldn't apply, because that would be a situation where deterrence of a very different kind would in fact be used as a step toward disarmament or as a way to maintain disarmament. Now, existential deterrence might well resolve the moral paradox of nuclear deterrence at or near zero, but maintaining and especially reconstituting a nuclear capacity could contribute to instability in a crisis. Moreover, a world in which a few powers dominate because of their capacity to reconstitute a nuclear arsenal or maintain conventional superiority or cyber warfare superiority, that would not reduce the incentive for nations to give up their nukes or not to obtain them, because if they only have, it's the poor man's bomb. If you're facing sophisticated cyber warfare or conventional warfare, you might want to retain your nukes as the one way to deter. So those disparities, you would still have, if you rely on existential deterrence, it's still going to be a relatively few countries who maintain the ability to deter based on their capacity to reconstitute the nuclear deterrent. And so you'd still have in place this double standard that exists with the non-proliferation treaty, where some nations get to have nukes and most nations don't. So then you have a second set of questions, which is relation to nuclear disarmament, conventional disarmament, and bigger questions about systems of cooperative security. And what the Vatican calls its connection with nuclear disarmament, conventional disarmament, and cooperative security, integral disarmament. So the church is clear, nuclear abolition does not require a change in human nature or an end to all war, but it does require a change in politics and institutions. So integral disarmament assumes that the long-term goal of abolishing nuclear weapons has to be tied to these broader efforts of general disarmament and also developing a more cosmopolitan system of cooperative security. But that raises a whole set of questions. Is that, do you really need general conventional disarmament in order to pursue nuclear disarmament? And you do need to move to a system of cooperative security instead of NATO's collective security type system in order to achieve nuclear disarmament. Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, was a strong supporter of a 1993 statement that I had a hand in calling for nuclear disarmament as a policy objective of the United States and other nuclear nations. But he was very critical, and he came to my office once. He was so upset about this, he actually came to my office to debate, and I had David on the phone. He said, "You do not need cooperative security in order to achieve nuclear disarmament. We can achieve nuclear disarmament with basically the international system we have now. You don't need a radical transformation of the international system in order to achieve nuclear disarmament." He was very clear about that. So it raises a question of what kind of systemic changes do we need in order to achieve nuclear disarmament? Is it something kind of a reformist agenda where we're basically learning from the lessons of the many lessons of conventional chemical weapons, nuclear disarmament that we already know how to do? We just need a little more political will? Or do you need something much more like the transformation after the end of the Cold War, which brought, as I said, a deep reduction of nuclear weapons, but not quite the peace dividend that the Vatican and other folks wanted? Or do you need something even more radical in terms of changing the international system in order to, if you want a nuclear weapon to be something less, nuclear deterrence to be disarmament to be less than some sort of utopian ideal? And so another question is, what about sovereignty? And this gets to the radical change or some sort of significant change in the international system. Almost any set of proposals for nuclear disarmament will require a serious rethinking of sovereignty and national security, because the nuclear halves are going to have to allow for much more intrusive verification, for example, of a nuclear disarmament agreement. If you're going to have missile defense, then you need to have some sort of a collaboration among nations, or you got to hand it over to the UN or somebody to maintain this missile defense system that's shared. But you're going to have a radical rethinking of sovereignty if you're going to have any opportunity to achieve or pursue nuclear disarmament. So those are some of the questions. I also talk about whether or not something similar to, you might consider something similar to the responsibility to protect doctrine. When you're at near zero, would there be a right to disarmament intervention in order to deal with a stop breakout or something like that? So those are the kinds of questions that I think ethicists and policymakers have to deal with. If nuclear disarmament is not going to just sound to most people in parishes as utopian and unrealistic. So we've gone on too long. What do y'all think? And General Bob Laddiff has joined us, who knows something about this, since he played a key role in the Strategic Air Command. Not to put you on the spot, but
I have all kinds of thoughts, but I'll let others.
oh, go ahead. I'll put you on the spot. Do we need to, can the questions be heard, Caesar, or do I need to repeat them? Okay, great.
If I wanted to say anything at all, I'd kind of like to correct an add to what I said with carbon capital. When I said I thought that the idea of nuclear hero that wasn't meant as a criticism. It was just meant. I agree with you that we should work with it. That's good. There's no question about that. But I'm just, as one who watches what's going on in the world, the idea that we will ever get to nuclear zero, even if Russia, China, and the US do, the rest of the world probably will not. And so I think that kind of throws a real stick in the gears of this idea of moving toward it. Again, I agree wholeheartedly with the idea that that's where we should go. It's just that I think we need to do that with our eyes open. Maybe try to make some accommodation for what I think is realistic outcome.
Which I take it as one reason in your average Catholic parish, you have, it's challenging to talk about this issue because I think most Catholic, like most Americans, think that deterrence works, right? It's necessary, it might be a necessary evil, but they think they're pretty convinced that deterrence works, and we haven't had a nuclear war since the use of nuclear weapons in war since Nagasaki. So I think you raise a fun. I think your position is a position that most people resonates with most people, right? So how do you address that?
Well, thanks, Jay. I don't have a ready answer, except that thinking about the kind of deterrence, as you were giving a summary of your chapter, underneath all of this is a moral and theological question of how to disarm the fear in our hearts, which I think is a pastoral question to raise in a parish context. So when you said, well, if we could get near to zero, could there be a kind of deterrence that would fit what Pope Francis align with what he has in mind? And I wonder about it because I think what he's condemning is, and also on the flip side of that, he's condemning a situation where we're constantly fearful and suspicious of each other, personally and internationally. And we have to address that as part of this issue of deterrence. How do we disarm the weapons, but also disarm our hearts? And I think the way I read him is, I think he's wanting us to try harder to get to a place where we're disarming our hearts. And I know that must sound terribly utopian, but from a theological and ethical point of view, we have the ultimate end theologically is life in God. And I would long for people at the parish level to have that conversation. Where are we ultimately heading? And it's true that we haven't had wars on our soil, but through the whole Cold War, we engaged in plenty of surrogate wars that were not nuclear. And what you said, David, that all the while nuclear weapons and the whole nuclear deterrence apparatus was serving as a kind of shield for these surrogate wars in places like all over Latin America, for one. How do we disarm the fear in our hearts so that we do move in the direction of a more cooperative vision of life together? You know, when you said McNamara said, no, you don't need cooperative security. I wish he were still around so we could talk with him further about that, because I think that's probably the direction that we'd need to go as humanity, to get to that point where we would disarm the fear of each other, to say everyone loses. And who's to gain if we're destroying the whole planet in the process? So.
Yeah, I like what you said there, and I think that's so true. And if McNamara were here, he would be on the table, was it want to do, whatever he was.
I almost did that just for when you mentioned it.
But I think, you know, during the Cold War era, we engaged in citizen diplomacy, Sharon was part of that, and with the group promoting enduring peace. And we tried to help people understand that folks in the Soviet Union are just like us, and they have children and families, and on top of this is this superstructure of political ideology that drives us all towards war and these massive military budgets. But at the human level, we have commonalities and we have same needs, and we need to somehow get to that so we can view people as human beings, as children of God, and not as the devil. So I think that's important. The other thing I would just say with Bob's argument, I agree. All my life, I've worked for reforms, specific steps, you know, for a nuclear test ban, for trying to not build particularly threatening new weapons. Like right today, you know, the sea-launched cruise missile issue is in the Congress, and I think there's hopefully still political agreement in the U.S. We don't need, whatever else we do with Russia, we don't need more nuclear weapons. We have plenty in it now. And so if we can keep that from not being built, that's a small victory. And I think we need to constantly look for policy steps that we can take that are realistic, that kind of reduce the threat a little bit and begin to introduce some of these bigger ideas about the longer term trajectory towards down to reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons.
What else is on your minds? Yeah, Tom.
I'm wondering, just to extend from the generals, correct? Yeah. The idea that even if the leaders in nuclear arsenal, us, Russia and China, were to miraculously, dramatically reduce our stocks, that the rest of the world might not follow along. But I mean, I think there's a lot of, or I wonder if you find potential in sort of using the history of the global South vis-a-vis nukes as a tool to raise consciousness and towards better change. I mean, it may have all been for cynical reasons because the leaders knew they had no chance of developing the nuclear program, but Latin America outlawed nukes in '67, Tlatelolco, Africa, I believe not long after. So, you know, I think there's like coalition building, or we can sort of attach the movement to, you know, achieve something closer to global equality, to honor the true sovereignty and equality of nations and continents in the global South who were way far ahead of us. Again, maybe for cynical reasons, but nevertheless, way far ahead of us decades ago. So, I don't know, is there any potential in that?
Well, South Africa is the one country that actually had nuclear weapons and gave them up.
Yeah.
So they had a few, but and that's a good example to follow. Agree.
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I am going to buy the book and I'm going to read it. So maybe my questions will be contained in the book. So I apologize if they're a bit self-evident. But I was wondering, I have two short questions. The first one is about personal responsibility and our participation in systems of injustice or oppression. But I do wonder, isn't it the Catholic doctrine precisely part of those systems? Like, I do wonder how much does it have to be so divergent, or is it the personal responsibility within larger systems? If we understand Catholicism as part of the larger system, much easier to kind of like bring together, to find a harmony there. If I'm able to connect to that larger system on that base, that's the question that I have. And
Yeah.
the second one was for David, and it was like, no, I understand what you say. There are a series of realist arguments that actually push us forward towards not only deterrence, but also disarmament. And I understand how they might converge in many ways with utopian or idealist arguments. Tell me, what is their main point of difference from your perspective when we compare these two different theories, or I would say their philosophies, their ways of being in the world, more than just political theories. Thank you.
I'll just say first, yes, technically, social sin is an analogous term, and at the root of it is personal. Formal sin involves personal agency. So social sin as a terminology in Catholic social teaching has developed to address these systemic issues that manifest moral disorder. And if you stop and ask who are the particular moral agents responsible for this, you'd be hard pressed to identify certain people. Now, in terms of formation of conscience, I think you're right on that. We have to start with, at the personal level, with particular persons gathering. I think it's helpful to gather people in small groups, because one of the dynamics of social sin is a kind of moral blindness. It's hard for me, if it's sort of the air that I'm breathing or the water I'm swimming in culturally, it's hard for me as an individual to see that. But if I can enter into dialogue with you and we can help each other discern what are the signs of our times at stake here, and how might we be complicit in a larger system that is in fact morally disordered, then we can begin to identify it and name it, and then identify ways in which we are complicit, and then take steps to address that, whatever that might mean. So in my chapter at the end of it, I have some questions for formation of conscience, personally and socially. And, one of them I threw out earlier about, taxes, but, thinking about people in the military, what is my role vis-a-vis the maintenance and possible use of nuclear weapons? And can I come together with others in a pastoral setting to discern in conscience, form my conscience, and then discern action steps from there that may include conscientious objection? What about people who work in manufacturing nuclear arms, or scientists who are working on nuclear related projects, or people involved ecologically who have the unfortunate task of trying to dispose of nuclear waste responsibly, for which the US government doesn't have a safe long-term plan, even today.
Yeah.
Well, we've been saying yet for decades, yes, right? And the solutions fall on very vulnerable people, indigenous peoples in particular, that, still Yucca Mountain on Navajo territory has been the only option that the government has gone back to. And it's cost lives of indigenous peoples in nuclear testing sites in the Southwest, where the soil and water have been contaminated, where nuclear testing was done so that it wouldn't, the contamination wouldn't carry over certain parts of the country. They did testing at a time when they could be assured that it would be concentrated and larger population areas wouldn't be affected, but as a result, indigenous peoples were affected. All of those things would be, I think, elements that we'd want to come together in a communal context at the parish level and be able to look at the signs of the times deeply and form our consciences together, right?
Yeah, I think your question, Josephine, is a good one. I mean, I don't disagree with a lot of the nuclear disarmament realists, and we work together. I've worked quite well with Secretary Perry and Schultz and others, and General Butler and others. I have great respect for Bob Ladeff and others who I've worked with. And so I think on 90% of what we're doing, we do agree. I think there is, though, a difference at the level of fundamental security doctrine, and I think this is where the cooperative security question is a critical one. And like within NATO strategy, why did we need to have NATO after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was disbanded? That was the time when we could have created some cooperative structures for all of European security, and Russia at that time was trying to be somewhat democratic and reformist. So a huge historic mistake there, but because of an inability to see that our security is best assured through cooperative relations with other states. And it is possible to do that, and we ought to be moving in that direction.
Well, we have just touched the surface. If you want to go deeper,
Yeah.
it's a thick book and it's available in the back. But thank you very much, Margie, David, for joining us, and thanks.